All right, what's this? Oh, that's right, vacation. Yes, hi there, friends. I'm going on vacation this week. Something that we started last year at this time. It went so well. My wife and kids informed me that we're going to do it again this year. So, not to leave you stranded, however, we're going to give you a great interview that we were happy and ecstatic and just enjoyed tremendously to do a couple of weeks back with our pal Aron Harris. He, the chief instigator of a great podcast called The Football Odyssey, part of the Sports History Network collection of podcasts. And we had a wonderful time. I don't know if Aron did, but I certainly did, regaling some of the memories around football teams of the past and leagues of yore. And not just in football, but also sort of more broadly as well. And frankly, if you're new to these proceedings and have not heard an episode of this show or relatively new to this feed, hopefully a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, I guess, as to why the hell I do what I do and what sort of makes me tick when it comes to putting this show together and why and how it all came about and that kind of stuff. Lots of fun. Thank you, Aron, for having us. And we hope you enjoy this little palate cleanser, shall we say, during my little vacation time. Thank you for indulging me on that. Thank you to Aron for having us. And we'll see you next week with a fun-filled episode. Until then, please sit back. Yes, that's what I'm trying to say. And enjoy.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Football Odyssey. This is your host, Aron Harris. On today's show, I'm pleased to welcome Tim Hanlon. Tim is the host and producer of Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to the exploration of what used to be in professional sports. In this episode, Tim and I discuss his roots as a podcaster and take a trip down memory lane for a fun and nostalgic conversation surrounding defunct football teams, rival football leagues, and much more. I think you all will enjoy hearing what Tim has to say being on the other end of an interview, and I highly recommend his show to anyone who hasn't listened to it, but appreciates obscure and vintage sports stories. So with that being said, thank you everyone for tuning in, and enjoy the show. All right, Tim Hanlon, the host of Good Seats Still Available. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm doing great. I appreciate your calling me and asking me to do this. I'm honored.
Yeah, of course, it's a pleasure. You're 40 years into the show now?
Jeez. Yeah, I sometimes it seems like it just started yesterday, and on usually when a deadline is bearing down on me, it seems like it's been forever. So it's somewhere in between, but yes, according to the calendar, it's been 4 years.
The show as it currently is, do you think that it's consistent with the vision you had going into the show, or do you think in some respects it's kind of taken on a life of its own?
Wow, good question. Look, the whole premise is a somewhat odd and borderline perverse fascination, interest in teams and leagues no longer with us. Right? That could be defunct. That could be previously domiciled. It's even, frankly, gotten a little bit into things outside of team-centric leagues and sports. Right? So events like the Tour de Trump, for example. Other. I think the Superstars is going to be something in our future. I mean, there is these. You can bend and squint really hard, right, and sort of remember and see sort of professional events and leagues and teams and all that kind of stuff. It really just started, frankly, as a diversion, right? Just an artistic, if you will, diversion from. The day job. I work in the realm of media consulting for the media industry, advertising and technology and stuff. And the family. I got two, teenage girls. That's all you need to know. That my wife and I have to, you can't control them, but you can only hope to contain them, right? But this is something for me. And one of these weird things as I've sort of supposedly grown up has been this very just sort of persistent interest in these teams and leagues that no longer exist, and I've always tried to figure out an outlet for it. I always thought it was going to be maybe an encyclopedic kind of book. I thought perhaps that would be, the blog thing. But the podcast sort of phenomenon really kind of captured my attention about 6 or 7 years ago from the day job side of things. And then I just literally forced myself to go to a conference in Chicago a couple of years ago, about 5 years ago, called Podcast Movement, still around. Um, and it's really sort of a DIY kind of thing. It's like, hey, interested in podcasting? Well, here's 2.5 days of people telling you how they did it, how they do it, what to watch out for, how to monetize, all that kind of stuff. So I just, I was like a sponge, and I said, screw it, I could do this. And having been a college broadcaster in the past, I've worked as a journalist in the past, right? So it just all sort of came together, and learned the podcast pieces to it. So when I started out, to your question, I really kind of just wanted to just literally just pick a team and every week try to have a conversation around it, preferably with somebody who was either part of it or there at the time. But as we sort of moved along, I recognized that as the decades roll on, people die,
Right.
and the stories get forgotten. And there's a lot of great stuff out there, and you can go into Wikipedia and all that. But I really like to talk to people who are, if not at the source, have spent time digging into the source of these stories, and frankly, largely because nobody else was doing it. It felt untapped to me. I always, when I was growing up, I always remember going to like the bookstore in the sports section and wondering, I was just waiting for that defunct book to be there on the shelf and go, I should have done this. And it never came. So I figured, podcasting is probably the quickest way. And conversations, I'm just amazed at just how many doors it's opened and further puzzles and enigmas it's laid out for us. Because as we've talked about on the show, and we'll talk about in a few minutes with football in particular, defunct, forgotten, relocated, and all those things. In the realm of pro sports, it is the gift that keeps on giving. And it's as relevant today as it was from when the first ever pro baseball franchise came and went back in the 1800s.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And like when I first found your show, it was about a year and a half ago. It was kind of a godsend because I love obscure sports stories and particularly football. But you've developed this whole community around you that loves these underserved stories that you're not going to get from a lot of the mainstream media outlets. And that's kind of the beauty of podcasting, where anybody can kind of create their own multimedia story around whatever they want. So I think it's good that you chose podcasting in particular, because it's different whenever you make a YouTube video or when you have a blog, where I think you're the one who's coming off as the authority on a subject. Whereas with a podcast, you can have people who are either there or people who have given in-depth research to the topic, and they can kind of tell you what they learned.
Yeah, look, and I never, I am by no means an expert on anything. I mean, I may be an occasional expert on certain teams or leagues that I'm personally interested in. But I will tell you, the vast majority of topics that we've gotten into, I'm either ignorant of, was unaware of, or frankly, wasn't necessarily interested in. But it fits this sort of odd genre that I created for myself 4 years ago, unwittingly. So, but it's curious, right? That we say it's a curious little podcast. It's not so little anymore, thank goodness,
Right.
I guess. But the curious part is absolutely there, because I try to approach it with as there's a whole ton of stuff I don't know about some of these stories, and frankly, even the ones I'm most passionate about. Right. So, as longtime listeners will know, this started out as more, I think we've discovered, is sort of a personal, I guess, abandonment in my teenage years from the team that I latched onto back then, which was the New York Cosmos of the North American Soccer League. Right. And what I found thematically is, yes, a lot of this, although not exclusively, but it does tend to sort of skew male and a little older. But we try to address that on a lot of it. There's a lot of women's sports stuff that we've gotten into, and more to come. And so we need to, we're trying to be as expansionary and accommodating as possible for a lot of different reasons. But the challenge and the reality is that it seems to me that a lot of our most passionate listeners had similar situations, right, in their, let's call it, impressionable youth, where sports fans, either participant or spectator or combinations of the two, have some very memorable experience of that first baseball game, that first football game, that whatever. And if it happened to be in a league that sort of came and went, um, it just sort of is like a double word score. And I think people identify with that. I think people identify with what they were doing at that time, the things, especially if they were interested in sports, that they were most interested and passionate about. And as life moves on, as one gets older, and school, career, and life, and all that other stuff, it's a bit of nostalgia, I think, for happier times, perhaps when you're younger and a little bit more carefree. And if you happen to have been a sports fan and you happen to have latched on to a club or a circuit or something that isn't around anymore, there's always that sort of curiosity, and generally with kind of a sort of a nostalgic glint and of happiness, I guess. And I will say this: the thing that I have learned about this is that everybody's got their own team and sport or whatever sort of vertical passion. Very few, although I'm shocked as the weeks go on, the months go on, that are just interested in defunctness generally, right? Because every time I do a third of the month soccer episode, it's like, oh, where's the football? Where's the hockey? Too much soccer. And then I'll do a whole bunch on hockey, and then the football fans will be crying out. And so the good news and the bad news is that's good, because people are like, okay, they're saying what they want. But this is an equal opportunity storytelling vehicle, I think. And there's so many great stories around all this stuff. And, if there's a sport or a team or a league that we haven't gotten to yet, hang tight, because we'll get there, because there's just plenty of it still yet to be explored.
Yeah, well, and that kind of goes back to the point made earlier about telling stories that are out of the mainstream. I mean, you did an episode on, I think it was the National Bowling League. Like, where else are you going to hear a story about that aside from your show? I mean, I can't really think of who else would really do something like that.
Well, you could also argue, why would anybody want to do that? But
Yeah.
it's fascinating to me. I mean, I didn't know about it, right? And I don't know how I discovered it, but to know that there was a team-based format in bowling, and frankly, what that to me did was, okay, well, that sounds odd, but let's scratch the surface of that a little bit.
Yeah.
What it did was it opened up the door to this other sort of box about pro bowling and what it was going through and what it was like in the late 50s, early 60s. And frankly, the origins of the PBA, the Professional Bowlers Association, which has sort of waxed and waned in popularity, especially with television. I mean, it was literally, this National Bowling League was in direct competition with this tour-based, individual-centric Pro Bowlers Association. Ultimately, the PBA won out as the way to go to market. In some senses, it's almost like tennis, too. World Team Tennis in the 70s was one manner by which the pro game came into sort of its own in the 70s. But, people don't sort of remember that there was this thing called World Championship Tennis that was started by Lamar Hunt. And there was also the beginnings of what was a tour-based scenario, too, in the World Tennis Association and then the Women's Tennis Association, right? So it's interesting. Golf had the same thing. We haven't gotten to it yet, but, golf's had a club, a team-centric league approach as well, right? So to me, this is all fascinating stuff. Most people, vast majority of people, even sports fans, don't even know that stuff. And to me, I don't know why, but to me, that's just fascinating. And I want to know more.
No, but given that knowledge that you have, I mean, I know you say you don't think of yourself as an expert, even on topics of teams that you follow. But would you, at the very least, at this point, consider yourself a sports historian?
Oh, armchair is got to be the descriptor there. Amateur, whatever other adjective you want to throw in there. No, by no means. I mean, I studied a fair bit of history in college and liberal arts and stuff. I'm fascinated by history generally, nonfiction. But I think sports, by definition, whether people recognize it or not, is essentially a history lesson. Now that sounds a little odd, right? When you're watching the Warriors and the Thunder go at it, right? I but the reality is that the Warriors had a story, right? They started in this little city called Philadelphia years and years ago, right? There were people and players and situations, and we've explored a bunch of them. Um, and the Thunder, right? You talk to anybody in Seattle, that's still a very raw topic, even though they moved 10 years ago or so.
Hmm.
Um, to me, these are living, breathing histories of sports, right? Um, doesn't mean you have to be, you have to do the research and do the work and to enjoy it. No, but to me, it's like, okay, how did this get here? How do these teams? Is it you don't just sort of wake up one day? Oh, there's this National Basketball Association. Well, there's a whole fitful story of how this NBA came into being. I mean, if you grew up like I did in the '70s, I was on life support, but it certainly was nowhere near what it is today. I mean, I could tell you stories about going to New Jersey Nets games in the Rutgers Athletic Center while the Meadowlands Arena was being built, and that being supposedly going to be the savior of this franchise. That the Nets played all over the place. They played in armories and the AB. I mean, just all kinds of stuff. And to me, again, that's sort of fascinating. And you always wonder. And I guess the fascination is like in the old days when you would sort of read the media guides or the yearbooks and stuff, you'd sort of see this history. It's like, okay, little snapshots of sort of how this team kind of got there, where the name come from, why the logo is the way it is. I don't know. To me, that's always been kind of the um, I don't know, the door opener to going into the game and enjoying it. Right, it's part of how to enjoy the game is to sort of understand like why this team exists and why they look the way they do and to me that's a huge Pandora's box, and I love to go deep into it, and the more obscure stuff the better.
Yeah, I completely agree because it seems to definitely like these kind of stories. You definitely need to have a sense of history more than just sports, but you can learn it through sports too. And it's kind of like
Aaron,
go ahead,
I think it's also this too. And look, now I'm going to start to be old man yelling at the clouds, right? So
go for it.
I'm of a certain age, right? My mid 50s, right? So young enough yet old enough, right? And sometimes I wonder which, depending on the time of day you ask me. But I do think that these kids today, right? Yeah, the pro sports is professional with a capital P,
Hmm.
uh, which is fine, but it's gargantuan, right? It's big business. It's private equity. It's SPACs. It's you know, not that money hasn't been part of the fabric of pro sports from the earliest days. It certainly has. Um, and some of the themes are universal: big boys and their toys, centrally owned versus franchised. Um, all kinds of sort of things that unions versus the owners and that kind of stuff. But the level at which this is now, and we've seen it with the Super League, right, in Europe, with the ill-fated Super League. We think ill-fated. Um, I don't know. I'm the biggest soccer fan you're going to find, especially of the U.S. variety, which is a fairly hardy bunch. Um, but we're approaching 30, 32 teams in MLS. You know, uh, do we need how many more? Is there another baseball franchise or two still to come? Uh, you know, uh, NHL is getting to 32 soon. With the Kraken coming in, and I don't know. I mean, maybe there will be room for 30, 40, 50 teams. I don't know. It just to me you wonder just how far all of that goes, and if it takes an economic cycle or two to kind of shake things loose to the foundation a little bit more. I just don't know if it's completely expansionary forever, right? And I, I just to me that also gets away from a little bit of sort of the heart, the soul, the fun, the joy, the competition, that kind of stuff. And I think, frankly, like I said before, everything old is new again. All these things, all these issues just keep coming around and over again. This thing going on in Europe with this proposed Super League is absolutely a great example of where and how and when does it go too far. And I'm not saying that the Super League idea is necessarily wrong. I think it is largely. I don't think it goes away. I don't think it's going to stop, big check writing owners you know, to billionaire more. But I also think it's also, good for the fans that they rebelled and sort of fought back and said, this may be a line not to cross. And that gives me hope that maybe the sort of essence of sports um, can actually sort of retain its soul and its joy and all that, the origination of that stuff before arguably it's too late.
Yeah,
How's
it
that?
definitely. Well, yeah, it definitely does feel suffocating at times. I'll read some old, I guess, like embedded journalist books about, a reporter goes and travels with, the Steelers, for example, in the '70s, or like what Paul Zimmerman did with the Jets in the last season of We View Bank, and you just kind of see the cultural difference between a pro athlete back in those days versus today. Because back then, obviously, you didn't have social media, you didn't have this constant television coverage around athletes. So they kind of felt like just one of the common people. You would often, some people in Pittsburgh would see like Ernie Holmes or Terry Bradshaw out and have a beer with them. Whereas when the money really started coming in more and more, there became, everybody had their guard up, it seemed. And you just feel like there's maybe a little bit of a disconnect more than there's ever been between professional sports and the fan bases that they follow.
Yeah, look, and I think football is especially indicative of that, right? I mean, we look back on the experiments that were the second version of the XFL, which might actually have a third rev to it, and certainly the Alliance of American Football. And every time you see a new league that sort of pops up in football in particular, you almost to a person you hear these stories of it's another shot to play. It's if it's not sort of a last chance at the pro thing, right? Making a career and a living and proving my doubters wrong and getting into the NFL and all that stuff. Um, a lot more of it, actually, a whole lot more of it, tends to be about, hey, this is an opportunity for me to continue to play because I love the game. I love playing, right? Sometimes people will say, I'll pay them to play, right? Um, and so for whatever reasons, I hear that theme over and over again, especially when there's a new league in a sport that's never sort of been successful on a pro level, or there's yet another iteration, I guess, of the something other than NFL variety of football. And I still think we'll see more. There is just a large pool of players that just want to continue to play and have some decent skills. Um, and I would argue that the fans of the AAF team in San Antonio or the XFL team that was in St. Louis, right? Those fan bases as examples, I think they were really very much into their teams and looked forward to being able to just they found them to be accessible, right? And that's part of the mix is you want to sort of promote and mingle a bit, and they didn't have any heirs because they're fledgling and struggling and there to play the game and they're overjoyed to do it. And that to me, that's a little bit of the spirit of sports that is largely missing when you get to the top tiers.
Yeah, I like how you bring up how a lot of these leagues are, in some regards, a shot of redemption for people who want to continue playing football. And I think most of them do it with the intent of trying to get back into the NFL because the money they're going to be making with a league like the AAF is not going to be beneficial to them. I live in Atlanta, and I actually went to an Atlanta Legends game. And you can see that the fan base, I think, is there. It's obviously not huge, but you see people generally wanted to support them. But in the back of your mind, you just always kind of think, is this really going to last as long as the executives want, or even maybe some of the diehard fans want? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
It almost just seems like when it comes to a competitive football league or a rival football league, it's just doomed to fail.
well, I think that's the way the NFL wants to hear you say that, right?
Precisely.
But I look, we've done a ton of episodes. One in particular with our pal Jeff Pearlman when he came out with his USFL book a couple of years ago. Just a couple of years ago already. It's hard to believe. Seems like it was yesterday. But You know, I believe that there is a slot, there is a place on the calendar for spring football. I know that the snobs will say, "Wow, developmental or spring league or all this kind of stuff." I I think there's an absolute opportunity to play the game in some level of professionalism in the spring months, right? To satiate um, that football interest and to either develop or give additional opportunities to a another layer of player that isn't necessarily at the top NFL level. And if it's somebody coming down from the big show or going up to the big show or just there for the joy of the game, I so what? There's a plethora of players that would qualify to play in that kind of realm. I think there's an appetite for it. There's certainly a market for it. Um, I think that the demise of the AAF and the second XFL, there are different reasons for each of them. Um, but I don't think it's because there's not a market for football in the spring. That's not just training games for colleges.
Yeah, I think there might be a market for it, but and this is something that you talked about with Scott Adamson when he was talking about football in Birmingham. And he was talking about at the end of the conversation how whenever, nowadays, if given the choice between watching like Major League Rugby and some off-brand football or what have you, he would rather watch Major League Rugby. And the younger version of himself would, laugh that off. But I do kind of wonder if like the overabundance of the NFL could sort of create this exhaustive effect for rival leagues in the spring, particularly because for me personally, I think I'm as big of a football fan as they come. But really, by the time the Super Bowl is over, that's my chance to kind of deplug from what's going on in the NFL. I have a very passive interest in the draft. I don't really follow free agency. And just as a history fan, that's a time for me to watch a lot of the older games that were well before my time. So I kind of wonder if the overexhaustion of having football 4 out of the 7 days a week plus college football, if you're a person that's in a market that has really successful teams in both college and NFL, are people just burned out by the time February comes about?
No, I think that's a fair point, and I think that's actually healthy, right? But you know, uh, the NFL certainly likes to keep the season going all year round too, right? They do own a television network, right? They do pump up this draft as sort of a mega event on its own. Um, there's all kinds of things that they try to sort of throw out there as sort of yeah, the European League idea was certainly one of those things. I agree. As long as you don't sort of see it as a direct competitor or as even skill wise or professionally, I just think that um, I, there is this sort of insatiable appetite for discretionary spending of income, especially when the pandemic sort of wanes, right? To go out and enjoy. I think some would argue the NFL experience is, like a lot of pro sports, already out of reach for the average fan, right? So there's the adjunct to that market where you could actually see some level of the pro game. Um, at the end of the day, it's also content, right? There's
Yeah.
how many dozens of channels out there and now streaming services and stuff. They're just eager to get stuff out there. I get the sense um, that there's not going to be any shortage of people trying to continue to sort of push the envelope on that kind of stuff. I just again I come back to it as this isn't necessarily competing with the NFL. I think it's a great opportunity for rule changes, right? And experimentation and stuff, right? I mean, that's what the minors are kind of for in lots of other sports. So, for example, I'm fascinated when the CFL came to the United States for a couple of years in the '90s, right? Why not a wider field? Why not a longer end zone? Why not, backfield in motion? And sure, I mean, 3 downs. Why not? I mean, you could make the argument that the NFL could use a few adjustments itself, right? And let's also look back too, right, in history, right? Without the AFL, you don't have the field goal posts at the back of the end zone. You don't have or the
Two-point
W
conversions.
right, well, yeah, all that kind of stuff. WFL too, frankly, for that matter. So and that's, by the way, that is absolutely part of the history of all kinds of pro sports: NBA basketball, the NHL and hockey, the NASL with soccer. With all innovations. Those are the things. And look, we're still tinkering with the top tier pro leagues all the time. Right, there are new rule changes this year for the NFL. Baseball's got the extra inning thing now with the guy on second. I mean, without the challenger leagues, right, this stuff doesn't happen faster.
I'm glad you brought up the rule change because I think one of the things that actually holds back rival leagues, and this is actually something that would get me to watch, is the fact that they try just to replicate the same style of football that the NFL has. I think a lot of people look at what had happened in 2001 with the XFL and think, "Oh, that was just a gimmick. No one's ever going to fully buy into it." I know what was his name, Michael McHugh, who was the commissioner for the United Football League. I think in your episode with him, he had mentioned how he wanted it to be real football. Well, in my opinion, to keep to keep a game football, to me, you need to have a line of scrimmage, and the ball can't move past the line of scrimmage more than once. Whether you're throwing or kicking, once it's past, it can't go forward anymore. Like, I would personally welcome a league that say, okay, we're gonna play football like it's 1914 or whatever. We're not gonna require you to, you know, be in place for 1 second after you shift. You could have multiple men in motion, only 5 or 6 men on the line of scrimmage. Like, I would actually watch that. That's what I want to see. I mean, even the second iteration of the XFL, I watched because they had a double forward pass. No one was building an entire offense around that, but I still just wanted to see because I'm not seeing it in the NFL. So I think a lot of leagues just completely brush off any rule changes as gimmicks when I think it could benefit them tremendously.
Well, look, I think there's actually you do this more basic for football, and that's make players two-way. Bring rosters down, maybe limit the rules a little bit, right? To so they don't sort of pass out from
Right.
exhaustion, right? But
Yeah.
I mean, that feels more pure and maybe more athletic and more intriguing, right? Because becomes a little bit more endurance becomes a bit more of the a factor, right? Like in soccer, where you only have a handful of substitutes for the entire game, and sometimes you miscalculate or player gets thrown out and stuff, and you have to scramble and the rest of the players have to kind of I don't know, a two-way kind of thing, maybe with one or two specialists, like a kicker and maybe a quarterback, right? I don't know that from an economic roster perspective, that would certainly be attractive.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
think you could sell it as a pure version of the game, and I think it could be a nice little extra twist to or a differentiator from the quote unquote classic NFL. And maybe, by the way, at the same time, identify some new players and some new ideas and concepts as to how to improve the big show. I don't know.
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, and that was something that in your episode that you did with Jim Foster of the Arena Football League, that's one of the things he looked at when he was working for the NFL and then went to the what was it, the Hall of Fame game, and he got to talk to like Night Train Lane and kind of talk about the two-way players, and everybody agreed, that's how it should be. I mean, my favorite part about football is all the different formations. Well, you can have as many different formations as you want. You're still only allowed 11 people, so you can still replicate what you're doing if it fits the scheme. But yeah, I would certainly be willing to see something like that, like a two-way, football league or something to that effect. I think could really prove beneficial, and I think a lot of it would appeal to even a lot of fan bases that are football fans, but not necessarily NFL fans. There's a few different coaching podcasts I listen to, and a lot of them come from high school, and a lot of them just like the way the high school game and the college football game is played. It might seem like a minimal difference, but with the hash marks being as far apart as they are in college and high school as opposed to NFL, it does make a lot of difference, and you see like a lot of ingenuity at that level that I think you could really catch on with a league like that.
Yeah, I mean, we also have to recognize too that the NFL is the NFL, right? And the NFL is going to
Yeah.
do what the NFL wants to do, and they are unique amongst all of the professional sports leagues, certainly in the United States, arguably on the world stage as well.
Hmm.
Uh, they're a really well-oiled machine, and in many respects propping up the television industry at the same time. Until there's a something more seismic or more, I don't know, existential in terms of a threat, I, I don't know how much changes at that
Yeah.
top level.
Right.
Rules changes or whatever. It's got to be probably some force from the outside that changes stuff. Maybe that's an economic downturn, or maybe the pandemic, sways a certain amount of people from not going to 70,000 seat, palaces like the new SoFi Stadium and Allegiant Stadium. I don't know. It's something, but maybe it's CTE, right? Maybe it's the player pensions thing. Maybe I don't know. It's I just to me it is it's peak. And don't get me wrong, I grew up as a big football fan, right? Big New York Giants fan. It was sort of almost sort of willed to me in my bloodlines, right, between Yankees in the baseball world and the football Giants and the growing up in northern New Jersey. That was just part of the deal. But it's harder to relate now. I don't know. For maybe it's old age and just uh, curmudgeonness creeping in, but it also feels a little. I'm not a gamer. Okay, I'm not a bettor. Um,
Mhm.
I don't. To your point, I don't follow the draft super religiously. I don't do fantasies. So maybe that's the adjunct that if I was doing any of those things, that would probably get me more connected to the NFL. But to me, I'm not. It's harder to. It doesn't resonate with me as much as it used to for whatever reasons.
No, as like a older fan, do you miss back when football was played in baseball stadiums?
Well, that's funny. No, let's be honest, right? I don't think that was optimal for anybody. It wasn't I mean,
Yeah.
understanding the stadium issues at the time and how cost efficient that was and how to satiate two major sports, and I see why there was, but I can't imagine as a player that was approaching anything but fun. I don't know if anybody has any nostalgia for that. I mean, it's intriguing to me because I remember it, right? I remember,
Yeah.
the Oakland Raider games in particular. Right? It's probably the
Right.
largest infield. I mean, the first football game I ever went to was a Jet game at Shea Stadium, um, and it was more clouds of dust than there was turf coming up from people's shoes. So I don't know if I don't know how much romance there was to it. I think it's just that just was. I'm certain that most of the players could not stand it. I know soccer players couldn't stand it for sure, but football I'm sure couldn't stand it either. And I'm sure the baseball and the other uses for the stadium didn't like it either because that gridiron that gridiron's forever, if you will. It doesn't neatly go away. It's gotten better these days with artificial turf, but I,
Yeah. I
I don't
think
know.
for me, I just like I see like that aesthetic in my head of just players in the 60s and 70s getting up with like dirt all over them, especially if it's raining, then it just gets really muddy. And to me, it just feels like such a gridiron game, even though it's played on a baseball field. I think it just complements the sports image very well.
Well, it was certainly more rough and tumble back then. I think it was certainly more. Look, I think those players are, and by the way, this applies to just about every pro sport. Are not only undervalued and under remembered, and but they need to be financially supported. And
Mm.
there's
Right.
absolutely stories about the pensions and the concussion stuff and the health issues and all that stuff. I honestly believe we have yet to really fully see the ramifications of all of that stuff, right? So I think we have to temper um, our fond memories of growing up watching the games that we loved, and remember too that a lot of the safety initiatives that have come since, and frankly the gigantic sums of money, right? Those two things were not part of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, even the 80s for a lot of these players and participants. And they're the ones whose legacies and stories that we're fascinated by. Yet they're also probably the ones that may be suffering the most and/or not being fully compensated for their issues, injuries, and a lack of paycheck. And I,
there's a big sort of hole in my sensibility about that and how that can be. There are a number of different sort of areas where that is being addressed, but I still see plenty of gaps.
Yeah, Jim Otto couldn't even walk hardly whenever he retired. So yeah, there's definitely only time will tell how it all plays out. But to your point about I guess people who aren't remembered as well or underserved, as a listener, I feel like the World Football League kind of holds a special place in your heart that I don't think other leagues do. And that's just kind of my feel as a listener. I'm curious if it's fair for me to say, and if so, why is that the case?
No, that's a good assessment. I think that in my mind, and I'm staring at a copy of the Gary Davidson quote unquote autobiography calling "Breaking the Game Wide Open," and it was written in 1974, I think, and it's his sort of, I guess, at the pinnacle of his powers, if you will, if you call him that, when he was, talking about how great his life and his story was by being part of the ABA, the World Hockey Association, and this WFL thing. So I think, though, the WFL, in my mind, is probably the best, brightest, shining example of sheer folly that we've kind of really ever explored on this show, and maybe is almost like the in the pantheon of craziness that in many cases I would actually have thought there would have been more of these kind of debacles to have been unearthed, and certainly we've seen some. But this one is, was the ultimate sort of house of cards, and it failed so spectacularly that it just, to me, is it's like the biggest Klieg light you can have on the defunct sports stage. And every team, the financial issues, teams moving in the middle of the season, completely reconstituting a second season. The big name grabs right out of the pages of the ABA and the WHA playbook. The collapse of the second season, not even finishing the season. I mean, the different colored pants by position. I mean, the colors and the of the teams, the logos, the way that the franchises were secured or unsecured, as creditors might describe it. It just, to me, is just, it is the ultimate circus, and to me, it's. I don't think there's any league that touches it, and it was only around for 2 years, for not even 2 years, for God's sakes.
Yeah, whatever. Mark Speck, I think is his name.
Yeah, Mark's episodes have been probably amongst the most listened to. The Detroit Wheels episode, a couple of others we've talked about. But yes, there's plenty more stories there, and that's the ultimate in defunctness.
Well, I think he sums it up best at the end of the episode. He's reading something from his book where he says, one of the players said they kept telling us lies, and the only truthful thing they told us was that we were bankrupt.
Yeah, I think
it just feels like that kind of sums up the entire league's year and a half existence perfectly.
Yeah, again, we've had some really interesting sort of delves into that. Like, we did a great episode, one of our earliest episodes, with guy named Howard Zuckerman, who was a producer for the old TVS television network, which, as your listeners may know, was it's an independent television network. It was created by Eddie Einhorn. But Howard Zuckerman was like the director, producer. He was telling us stories about they would park their trucks like in the middle of the country and find out which team was still around to know which game to go to the next week. I mean, that was that nuts. And that feels like a movie to me. That feels like a mini series. That feels like a streaming couple of episodes. It just seems like there's so much there. And Gary Davidson, God bless, is still around, from what I understand. We've been trying to figure out a way to get to him. We did, however, sort of tangentially get to, I think, the other guy who's on the Mount Rushmore, Dennis Murphy, right, who was part of the ABA story, the WHA story for sure. These are, these are guys who, kind of went to the well and, thought that their fame and fortune would come by creating these new leagues and, getting franchises and, filling the blanks maybe later on as time went on. And many cases they ran out of crayons for the coloring books.
All right, what's this? Box of Awesome. Oh, man. Hey, this summer, Bespoke Post is here to take your adventures to the next level with their new lineup of must-have Box of Awesome collections. Bespoke Post partners with small businesses and emerging brands to bring you the most unique goods every month. I have been lucky enough to receive one of these boxes, and the one I chose is called the Weekender, and it's a gorgeous overnight bag in beautiful colors. Mine is in olive with brown trim, but it comes in all kinds of different colors, and it's just perfect for those weekend getaways. You don't need sort of that valise or that overnight garment bag or any of that kind of stuff. And it's fantastic, and it comes from a company that I never would have heard of called Line of Trade, and they've really done a gorgeous job with this thing, and I've been using it literally the last couple of weeks for all my little travel needs. And so no matter what you're into, Box of Awesome has you covered. From travel and outdoor gear to breezy summer styles and grooming goods, Box of Awesome has collections for just about every part of your life. Now, I notice a whole bunch of other ones. If you're sort of into bourbon sampling, if you're an outdoorsman, if you enjoy sort of on-the-go beverages, especially when you're out there in the hot sun, perhaps you're a big taco fan. And you want to sort of reinvigorate your process of creating and enjoying taco night at your own home. All those and many, many more. So fantastic and very creative things. It's clothing. Some of them are food related. Some of them have to do with personal grooming. They're just awesome, literally and figuratively, collections of stuff. And they're yours to peruse and subscribe to. And it's a tremendous concept. And again, Box of Awesome. It's something that you can take advantage of. To get started, you take the quiz at boxofawesome.com, and your answers will help them pick the right Box of Awesome for you. They release new boxes every month across a ton of different categories, as I just hinted at to you, and it's free to sign up. Plus, you can also skip a month or cancel at any time. Each box costs only $45, but it's got at least guaranteed to be over $70 worth of gear inside. It's a really cool concept. Check them out. And of course, we've got an incentive for you to do so. Get 20% off your first monthly box when you sign up at boxofawesome.com and enter the code GOODSEATS at checkout. Yes, that's boxofawesome.com, promo code GOODSEATS for 20% off your first box. Thank you, Box of Awesome. And please, let's enjoy the rest of our conversation.
Do you have any memories watching the WFL when you were growing up?
Very vaguely. I do remember that they had, I remember Merle Harmon, of course. He was the voice of TVS generally. I remember they had a third person in the booth each game from the world of Hollywood or television. That kind. I know Burt Reynolds was on once. George Plimpton was on as the third person once. They had a whole bunch of other people and stuff. I vaguely remember trying to find when the game was going to be on. Now, I grew up in New York, so it was on Channel 5 there, the old now Fox station, but the old WNEW television, Metro Media, I guess at the time. But this TVS network, right, doesn't mean that every station cleared the game live back in the day. Same with the bowl games that TBS did, and Mislu was another one. But so I remember looking at the TV guide to see which teams were playing, and occasionally tuning in. To me, it was fascinating because it's like, what is this thing?
Now, why do you think that some defunct leagues are continue to live on, like the WFL or like the USFL, either through internet fan pages or mass market memorabilia. And why do you think others are just kind of completely lost to history, like the American Football Association or the Continental Football League?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think memorabilia has a lot to do with it, and the realities of uh, trading cards and eBay and maybe coming back in the realm of NFTs, where they're truly digitally authenticated and fraud free, so to speak. I think some of it has to do with that. I think that's maybe why baseball has lasted so long in terms of like being the ultimate sort of history project. Um, because I think baseball's was the earliest sport really in this country, and was merchandised probably earlier than most of the professional sports today. Um, and it just feels to me like it's probably the sort of the quintessential portal, I guess, to people's memories of those sports and leagues. Right? Is that program, that ticket stub, that pennant, that signed, 8x10 glossy. I don't know. Um, I think it also there's also a bit of media involved, meaning if it was sort of a 1960s onward kind of league situation, there's probably a fair chance, especially as the years roll on, that there would have been either radio/audio broadcasts or television, now video broadcasts, and that just ensures stuff going on. I mean, YouTube, right? Let's talk about YouTube for a second.
Please.
It's God's gift to any sports fan, a lot of other genres too, for that matter. But um, you know, and there's more being made every day. But just the ability to find those clips of the WFL, or to see that there was, uh, what the AFL actually looked like in full color, aside from the occasional documentary on Showtime or something. It's all there, right? And here's the kicker, right? All the stuff that's come since literally gets put up there forever, right? So every single game, highlights as well as full actual games of the AAF, right, in its one glorious season, will be forever etched in the annals of digital media, right? So it's never going away. So there's going to be people who go back and go, "Holy crap, this thing existed!" I mean, it's almost like discovering old television shows now that all these streaming services are out, and they're trying to figure out, mine all this stuff for library and stuff. Like, I'm a huge David Letterman fan from the 80s and 90s, right? So there's this guy named Don Geller, who literally, it's just like his life's work. He's like 70 years old now. He literally has every episode from all the David Letterman shows digitized, and he curates all kinds of stuff, and they all live on YouTube, right? No, there's no TV network with the rights to David Letterman's show anymore, but it's there. It's fascinating, and it allows me. I can go back at any time, and I can turn it on and port it over to the TV set, and just like you, we can watch old games if we want to, right? There's these guys who were trying to get on the show. They're still reluctant. I think they want to get this story up and running, called the Dead Football League or the Dead Football Network. You're probably aware of them, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
They literally stream games from all these forgotten leagues and stuff.
Mm.
And literally, it's like tuning into a kaleidoscope of football history. If you're into that stuff, it's fantastic. It's great. I find it endlessly fascinating. So I think media has something to do with it. I think nostalgia, and I think memorabilia has something to do with it. And look, the Continental Football League is certainly we want to get into some of those stories. Regional. How many programs? How many fans? Not many. Right? National Bowling League. Very challenging to find stuff about that. Thank God we found the good doctor with his almost thesis on the story. But it's there. And here's the kicker, and this is the thing I love about this genre, football and otherwise. I'm constantly amazed, not only at other people who somehow latch onto this topic and find it similarly interesting, but that there's always a new discovery to be found, either something in the microfiche or a piece of something that came out in a video, or somebody died and their attic or their basement had a box of something that nobody's ever seen before. And that to me is like, it's like a treasure hunt. I live for that kind of stuff. That's how sad my life has become. But that's fascinating. Don't get me wrong. I'm not. I used to be a collector. I don't collect any of that stuff anymore. I kind of got over all that. But I think that to me is always, there are always going to be new discoveries about what used to be. I'm certain of that. And that to me just keeps me enthusiastic about, I don't know, continuing to do this silly little show every week.
Yeah, I don't think it's sad at all. I mean, I'm in the same camp as you, where YouTube for me, I use YouTube more than anything. I use YouTube more than cable, more than Netflix, Prime. I mean, that to me has just absolutely been the best resource that I could ever possibly imagine. I watch so many old games. There's a lot of subscribers I go to that have like long form highlights, like half hour long from vintage games. I can watch a lot of international football games that way. It really has been a savior for me, like as a researcher and as a fan. I mean, I just think it's incredible, and I think a lot of that kind of goes to the nostalgia effect as well. I mean, I'm 26 years old, so a lot of what I'm watching happened way before my time. But even if I'm watching a game from like 2008, I could be like, "Oh man, I forgot about him." He was a good player, wasn't a Hall of Fame or anything like that. But you still get like that warm feeling watching games on tape, that grainy image. You really kind of transport yourself into a world that you weren't a part of, but it still feels familiar.
I will say there is one thing that I've learned from all all of this, at football specifically, but also all the sports and all the things that we've discussed, is that there's absolutely trends that come and go, and especially amongst younger sports fans who sort of latch onto the show or have their comments and stuff and their opinions. I think a lot of them, once they sort of get into a couple of our episodes, they sort of recognize, hey, you know what? There's not a whole lot that's new under the sun. A lot of these ideas, right. A lot of these things, a whole bunch of things, really are go back to some of the earliest days. I mean, the idea of single entity versus a franchise, right? That's the more we've sort of unearthed that goes all the way back to debates back in the 1890s around baseball and how that should look. It's fascinating to me to see the same arcs of labor strife, economics, how fans are or aren't part of the mix, owners and their grandiosities, their beliefs in big business and what could be. It's just fascinating to watch these similar themes play over and over again. And it's that old proverb, right? Those who ignore history are, largely burdened with having to repeat it. And that seems to play out in our little 4-year exploration thus far.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And in your within the shows that you've done so far, is there one football team that you have really been captivated by, either a team that you still think about to this day after having a guest on, or even just doing your own research, you just really grew to have a passion for the story that was being told?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to go with the New York Titans.
Okay.
And why? Certainly, well, it was years before I was born, but it's a New York team that I kind of didn't really know about. And obviously they live on in the Jets, but I think there's at least 2 generations of fans that don't even know that the New York Jets, before they moved to Shea Stadium and, ultimately by the end of the decade, proved that the AFL was not only worthy to compete with the NFL, but could actually beat the legacy teams in the NFL with Joe Namath and all. I just fascinated to go back over time, over the years, and learn that there was this franchise that was placed in a decrepit, fallen apart polo grounds that, had to be a New York team in the AFL, right? Because you can't start a league without being in the biggest media market in the country. And that team was, I want to say, flimsily created, but it certainly was not the one with the most amount of money behind it. And, everything from the logo and the colors and but it seems like it's completely been steamrolled. And we've seen this, right? We see this a lot with all kinds of big pro leagues who don't want to remember or recall teams of the past or where teams were previously located, the histories of those teams, which historians and super fans kind of care about, but leagues and the money behind them don't necessarily want to. To me, that's like an unearthed like part of the story that any Jets fan, frankly, should know about, because it's all without the Titans, there ain't no Jets, right? Now that said, since 1969, most people would care less about there ain't no Jets, right? Because they haven't really done much. But I digress. Right. I mean, but my point is, to me, I think that is the team that kind of sticks out in my mind. Don Maynard, and there's to me, that's a fascinating 2.5, almost 3 years, and it's also, by the way, part of the story of New York at the time, right? So Robert Moses, the reconstruction of the city to be much more accommodating to cars, the advent of Shea Stadium, right? Why did that come to play? Because 2 baseball teams left in 1957, right? And they wanted to put a new baseball team in there, and this Continental League, which we've also explored, is part of that too, right? So without that, you don't have, hey, here's a new stadium being built, we could also put a football team in there. So it's weird, but it gets into all kinds of different layers of history. And, you could be, I guess, forgiven for not knowing that from 1960 to 1963, there was an AFL football franchise known as the New York Titans. And that to me is a really good example of the kind of stuff we love to obsess about.
Yeah, I haven't listened to that episode, but I did listen to the one about the Jets. I can't remember what the author's name was, but he wrote a book about the Jets outside of Namath.
Bob Lederer. Yeah, it was a great episode.
Yeah, I thought that was a really good episode, because I mean that's a team that I don't think a lot of people really think about. I mean, obviously they're going to live in the people's memories forever because of the upset of Super Bowl III, but it's fascinating when you watch that actual Super Bowl and you kind of see how everybody really had to pull their own weight. I mean, Joe didn't really have the best game he's ever played of his life. Matt Snell had to carry the rock a good amount, Riggins and Don Maynard. I mean, I think it was a really good approach to a story I feel like has been told often, but he really approached it from a unique angle. So I really enjoyed that episode too.
Well, thanks. We obviously focus on sort of incarnations, I guess, and the Jets obviously still exist today, but the AFL version of the Jets don't, right? And that to me was almost that's obviously the exclamation point of their AFL lives was that winning that championship, right? And many would argue it's never been the same since, but to me, that's all part of the tableau. And look, as you know, and I appreciate all of your in-depth listening, because you've had some great questions, and it shows that you've actually listened, which reminds me to ask yourselves to have your mental health checked, because there are other things in life than listening to every single one of our 200 and some odd episodes. But I still appreciate it. It is not only is it fascinating to me, I'm just amazed at just how much there's still out there to unearth, and how many other people out there find it to be similarly interesting. I just wonder. I wonder what's ahead. I mean, there's so many different stories that are percolating. You may know that if in my social media feeds, I'll occasionally post something that I call future episode watch. Mm-hmm. Right. So, and I said it earlier in our conversation. I mean, this is kind of the gift that keeps on giving, right? It's like the old Jay Leno commercial with Doritos. If you finish, well, don't worry, we'll make more. The Oakland A's might be the next ones, right? So,
right, yeah.
Stay tuned, right? So it's weird, but this storyline, this niche, is ironically timely as today's headlines, and that's we love that stuff, and that's kind of why we keep doing it, and until we're probably told otherwise.
Well, yeah, I mean, and speaking of timely, like with the A's possibly relocating, I mean, personally, I also love your Baltimore episodes, because I didn't really realize, because I know you had Jack Gilden on your show, and he was actually one of the first people I interviewed for my show too, and I was really shocked, I guess, in a way, to find out how much of an inferiority complex that Baltimore had, and really like how the Colts were as significant to the citizens of Baltimore as like a high school team would be in rural Texas. So like, and whenever I've noticed that when you have an episode about Baltimore, you're trying to kind of search for an answer on where does their legacy exist, right? Because Indianapolis isn't really going to give much consideration to what happened in Baltimore. They have created their own history, and Baltimore has moved on with the Ravens. And then you go in the Stallions and the Stars. It's like there's a lot of kind of how do I say, kind of like Ghost in a way. And I know that was another person that you had on the show who made that documentary about the Ghost of 33rd Street.
Yeah, I mean, there's we kind of a lot of times when there are teams that either don't exist literally, they came to a cul-de-sac and just died an ugly death, or they've gone on to other incarnations. I'm always interested for I don't know, for completism, to find or to understand or ask, and a lot of times there actually isn't an answer. Where do these histories officially live?
Mm-hmm.
And for leagues and teams that are gone completely, that can be an open-ended question. But when you talk about, say, the Minnesota North Stars of the NHL, well, that's a team that broke into different parts and went into different places. And then when a team comes back after having been abandoned as a market, in the case of Minneapolis St. Paul, do they get the opportunity to kind of rekindle that and bring that back in, since it is a return of NHL hockey to that market? I think the NFL it's a little harder, but I mean, I think the Raiders thing is going to be interesting, right, over time, right? I mean, I literally yesterday just saw, you probably did too, this new artist's rendering of this new end zone party thing that they're going to have at Allegiant Stadium for the Raiders. It's literally like, bar service, and it's almost like going to a strip club, but in the end zone. Maybe sans the scantily clad lady. I don't know. Maybe that's part of it. But you look
Vegas.
It's Vegas, baby. Sure. You look at the renderings. It's like, do we really need a Tao nightclub right in the end zone? I mean, okay. So put that aside. But if I'm an Oakland fan, I mean, from like the first version, the AFL version, right, and even the NFL version before they moved to LA and then back to Oakland. I'm talking about the first real original Oakland, lineage from AFL into NFL, and the true, Al Davis years and the Stickum and all that stuff, right? And I look at what these games are going to look like on television and in person in Las Vegas. I don't know. To me, there's a break there. I'm not saying I enjoyed the Raiders and the way that they bent the rules a lot, and played their sort of brand of football, but it was a brand, right? You knew what you're getting, right? It was black and blue, literally, or black and gray in this case. But I don't know. It just feels hollow to me. So to me, where does that? I'm going to say that. So where does that Oakland Raiders legacy live? Officially, I guess it's going to be in Las Vegas. That's where the Raiders live now. Okay. And I guess that's the politically correct answer to that question. But if I'm an abandoned Oakland Raider fan, and I grew up, not rooting for the 49ers, nor ever will. Right. I don't know. My allegiances are now kind of probably, up for grabs. Maybe I don't even come back to the game anymore. Maybe I don't care anymore. Maybe I just move on with my life. Maybe there's another league that comes in and says, hey, we're going to play in Oakland because Oakland was an abandoned market, right? And we've seen this before too. So does Birmingham. So does Memphis. There's a lot of these cities that, are still have great football fans, but, somehow have been left behind. There's an example, and God bless the Raiders. I mean, I take the payday too, I guess, but I don't know. It doesn't seem like the Raiders that got us to where we are today.
Well, they returned to Oakland once. I'm not going to rule out that it could happen again down the road.
Well, you're more of an optimist. I don't. I think it's
I'm not saying I think it's going to happen, but yeah, I guess in today's world you can never rule it out. I mean, Oakland, I
Yeah.
think, is one of those teams too that will, like, kind of, we talked about how some teams just live on. Like Oakland, I feel like even though they're in Vegas, when I hear the Raiders, I still immediately think of Oakland. Like Vegas is separate from the Raiders as of right now in my mind, unless they were to have some real success over the next few years or so. I'm still going to associate the Raiders with Oakland.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, this is where the chief marketing officer comes into play because you can
Right.
regionalize it, right, and arguably say, hey, we're gonna reach out to all of the fans from the East Bay eastward, shall we say, to Las Vegas, and we're going to claim all of that geography for ourselves. Let the northern wine country and the Bay and then the Silicon Valley, let them have the 49ers, right? But the rest of it and beyond, and maybe there's got to be some ways to sort of make it happen. It still rings hollow to me. And look, let's be honest too, right? We all know what's going on with the A's right now. You know, it's gamesmanship, right? It's you got to do what you got to do to get communities and the tax dollars and the tax
Yeah.
breaks and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's actually even a bigger source of ill what for what pro sports looks like. I mean, it's real estate, right? You look at what the Braves are doing. I don't mean to get off the football topic, but you look at what the
Yeah.
Braves done, right, in Atlanta, right? You live in the area, right? I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but I'll start with mine. I don't, I get it, right? You create a new ballpark for yourself in a well-off suburb, um, and you build it as part of a larger real estate complex that gives you other revenue streams and more control, I guess, over your financial future. But okay, but take that, put that aside, and then say, okay, baseball, the Braves, a team that's lived probably one of the longest lineages of all of baseball, all of sports in the United States, and they're playing in this stadium that's literally like part of an office park. Um, and I haven't been there, but it's my understanding and my reading and what I've seen on television. I don't know. That feels a little hollow to me. But then again, maybe I'm just being an old curmudgeon. What do you think? I mean, to me, that's what I fear is the next phase of pro sports. And I don't know, it just feels more like it's real estate development instead of sport.
I personally am okay with it because I believe the surrounding area really is state of the art. And I haven't been to too many other baseball stadiums, but you have to sell more than just the game at this point, right? Like you really have to try to reach fans who maybe aren't even fans of the sport. Like personally, I've been to they call it the Battery, and I've been there several times, but I've only gone to a few Braves games because, for someone like me, I enjoy the atmosphere there. I enjoy the bars, the restaurants, the amenities that it provides. I can see where some people maybe like the more traditional avenue of a ballpark. But compared to where the Braves were playing at, I think it was Turner Field. I mean, it's an area that I think they could have tried to spruce up, but they really didn't for a while. And I think oftentimes you'll see what happens is a lot of these teams move. And I think you can comment and attest to this because the stadium commissioner, whoever oversees it, just doesn't take care of it or update it to a certain point. There's always going to be a better offer out there, but I think to a certain point, if the current tenants aren't going to try to keep you there, then it only makes sense to look elsewhere.
No, I understand that argument. Trust me, and the economics of it. And look, the casual fan, I get that too. I get the, but I remember this going to the first time to City Field in New York for the first couple of Mets games in the new place. It's great. By the way, I think it's better than Yankee Stadium, which is more like a mausoleum than anything else. But um, it feels like it's an amusement park,
Yeah.
and don't get me wrong, you want to have fun at the ballpark, no doubt, right? But when the game feels like it's starting to become more of a sideshow versus the main event, that's when I start. And again, I'm not naive to the idea of how business runs in pro sports. But I just fear every time the game becomes more the background, like I think with betting. I think betting is An interesting development, right? And look, gee, what could go wrong, right? The sanctity of the sport, the competitiveness, right? I mean, the Astros with what could go wrong? Seriously, what could go wrong with betting in sports, right? After years and years and years and years of pushing back on that. Hello, Pete Rose, right?
Yeah.
You don't think that something's not going to happen there? I mean, and that's when it's too late. When that sanctity of the competition gets somehow breached, we're all in big danger then. I don't know if sports ever recovers from something like that.
Did you ever read the book Interference by Dan Moldea?
I have not.
Yeah, he was a journalist that predominantly reports on organized crime. I don't know if he's still writing, but he wrote a book, I think, in the late 80s, maybe it was the early 90s, essentially about the relationship between various NFL owners and gamblers and kind of the relationship between some players and bookies that they knew and about placing bets. It kind of cuts deeper than the like Alex Karras, Paul Hornung suspension. And it's an interesting book to kind of see, I guess, the relationship. I mean, there's no finite evidence that any game was ever fixed or that any points were shaved, aside from, well, I don't know if there wasn't actually successful. There was an attempt in the 40s in the 1946 championship game. But yeah, stuff like that just definitely kind of show, and also details sort of like the NFL Securities Department attempts to thwart these efforts. But it does actually show how there is unsavory money and unsavory personalities that do flock to sports betting in that sense. And today it seems like there's so much money at stake with the athletes themselves that maybe it's going to be hard to persuade them or compromise them. But yeah, it definitely does feel like there could be an unsavory element that can creep into there.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't imagine it's. It's very interesting, right? I mean, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, this wasn't even a conversation, right? It wasn't even a possibility. I mean, Las Vegas being the home of an actual pro sports franchise in a top tier league was unthinkable, but it exists today. I mean, cannabis, right? Is essentially legalized now, not at the federal level, but essentially almost everything but, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of things that, just times move on and times evolve. But I keep wondering about the sport. I live in Chicago now. My wife and her family, I married into this Cub fandom thing, which is really more of an illness than it is anything else. But I tolerate it because, that's what good husbands do. But, you see Wrigley Field, right? It's the friendly confines, but it's now one big real estate project, right? It's all about the parks and the buildings around it and the hotel now. And again, I'm not trying to sort of be nostalgic for the old days. I wasn't even here, until 2000, right? But I do understand I do understand the history. I do understand, that the average fan is being priced out of games, and I understand that you walk in now into Wrigleyville, it's become more like a theme park, and if that's what it takes to keep fans and casual fans interested in coming and paying for the games and stuff, it's great. But I go to games when I go to games, or maybe I'll go back again soon. It feels to me more about having a party, and you could care less about the game. And I don't know. There's a game going on here, and you're entitled to do what you want to do while you're at the game. But I don't know. The sport is like kind of there, and I hate to see anything that kind of makes the sport itself kind of suffer. And football's probably got the biggest to lose, right? Because they've got the most money sort of at stake, and I worry about that too.
Yeah, well, I think that's that's one argument that a lot of people make when they flock to college football. I mean, living in Atlanta, I'm surrounded by a lot more college football fans. Whether it's Alabama, Auburn, UGA, obviously. But people just say, they love the atmosphere of college football because it's the game. Obviously when you go to, the Falcons Stadium, Mercedes-Benz is state of the art. But I'm telling you, Tim, when I was there, I went to a game, I think, it had to be 2 years ago because last year there was no one there, but they were playing the Rams. And I'm telling you, man, it was a great stadium, but the team just was obviously in a bad season. And a buddy of mine, we got nosebleeds, but we could go down to the next deck without any trouble. So it's like, you have this whole experience that is drawing people away from the actual seats and just persuading them or motivating them just to walk around to see the state of the art stadium and all the amenities that it could provide. Whereas like with a college game, you go to UGA in Athens, you're in the seat with God, 80 other thousand people.
Yeah, and you got to pay attention to the game.
Yeah, precisely. Well, everybody's shouting in your ear. You have to see what the excitement's about. I mean, I've been to Pittsburgh a couple times for a game, and Heinz Field. I never got to see Three Rivers Stadium, but Heinz Field I think has done a good job of still making the stadium contemporary while also keeping the focus on the actual game. I mean, in the surrounding area, they have some really cool spots, but it's nothing that's going to draw you away from the actual on-field play.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the stadium and in-person experience evolves to as the next number of months and years play out in a post-pandemic world. And look, I'm not sure that we'll ever not. I'm not sure we're past other pandemics and other sort of issues and stuff too. To think that it just sort of reflexively goes back to what it used to be. I think maybe in the short term it might, because it's just people been, they haven't been to a game in a couple of years and they're dying to go. But I think over time though, I'm not sure that the dynamic is going to be the same. And it'll be interesting to see if these, especially these newest constructed facilities, are able to sort of maximize all those revenues that were kind of comprised back when the pandemic wasn't even a thing yet. So I don't know. I just think the live fan experience is going to change, and I'm not sure anybody really fully knows how it's going to evolve over time. I just simply filling the stadiums back up because there's some level of herd immunity. I don't know. Psychically, I'm not sure everybody's really prepared to do that anymore.
Yeah, definitely. Only time will tell. I have just one more football question that I'm curious to get your opinion on, and then we'll wrap this up. So, you've had a lot of conversations about defunct leagues and in markets that never have had an NFL franchise, kind of going back to like the topic of like Oakland and what used to be Vegas. In talking to various guests and authors that you have spoken with, do you find like one consistent theme, or maybe not one consistent theme, but consistent themes across these off-brand football teams in cities like Orlando, Birmingham, San Antonio, and Sacramento, and so on and so forth, that kind of draws people in only for it to fail after a few years? Like, do you notice like consistent theme between these cities, or do you think each market is kind of unique and can't be really clustered together?
I think there are two elements. One is that there's a reason why these markets tend to make the initial short lists when new leagues are being thought of, because they do have some level of either football history, heritage, or at the collegiate level, some affinity. Right? There's a proven base of fans for quote unquote football. And I think all those markets and then some tend to prove that. I think the other though issue that comes into play, and we've sort of explored this a little bit on some of our other episodes, is let's call them smaller markets. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there's a long-standing, unwritten sort of understanding that having a professional sports team, especially that of the quote-unquote Big Four, you can maybe argue this, a few more sort of wrinkles to that sort of law or that rule, will connote major league status to said city, right? So our conversations around the Indiana Pacers, so the ABA, very much rooted into that. I think when Lamar Hunt moved the Dallas Texans of the AFL to Kansas City to become the Chiefs, although as listeners may remember, they were actually going to be called the Kansas City Texans, if you can believe that. Luckily, Lamar was talked out of it. I find that hard to believe, but Michael McCambridge swears that that's a true story. So he's the master of that story. I'm not gonna fight him. But I do think that there is always a desire of a city. I see it now. We had our conversation with Dan Issel about a year ago about the ABA, and he's trying to get Louisville to get the next NBA franchise, right? So I think there is something inherent in pride, civic spirit, and a belief that at least a major league pro team of some sort is equal to major league status as a city. And I think that drives, a lot of interest in and around that kind of stuff. So, and sometimes it takes a while. We had a great conversation with Upton Bell. I highly recommend that episode to everybody. Upton Bell is the son of Bert Bell, one of the most influential NFL commissioners in the entire history of the league. And he was a guy who bought a WFL franchise, the New York Stars, which were barely perceptible on the New York sports media landscape, playing at Downing Stadium and on Randall's Island, and just in almost under the cloak of darkness, and moved it to Charlotte. Now, Charlotte at that time in the 1974, was not the sort of major league market it's become, but that to me that's fun to watch stuff, right? Because Sacramento's really come into its own. The Kings moving their NBA and maybe getting an MLS franchise. I mean, there's a lot of Louisville. I think is absolutely one of those cities sort of on the cusp. They're one pro franchise away from. I think Salt Lake has really come, and there's a lot of sort of mid-sized cities that just we'll see look at Nashville over the last number of years, right? So to me, those markets have always been sort of on the cusp, and it wouldn't surprise me if, whether it's another football league of some sort or some other sport, that kind of puts a Birmingham over the top. It certainly happened to Orlando. Memphis is certainly coming along. All these cities, right? And I think you'll see more of them to come. And again, look, who thought Las Vegas would ever get to that level, aside from being a destination? And look at it now; it's got 2, maybe going on 3 top tier sports franchises.
Yes, Orlando for me is a tough one, man, because you have 3 teams in Florida already, and you also have, well, I guess maybe you would never get a franchise in the NFL that would move there, but I guess I could see another competing league that could draw an audience in Central Florida. It just kind of feels like you had the Jacksonville Jaguars in North Florida that capture the northern audience, Miami and South, and Tampa Bay in this sort of central location. But I guess
honestly, I cannot imagine Jacksonville staying in Jacksonville. I could easily see them moving to Orlando and regionalizing that franchise and doubling down and doubling their money in the process. I think it's absolutely achievable. No disrespect to Jacksonville, but Jacksonville's I remember the Jacksonville team end of the North American Soccer League episode this week for the former New England team end. I mean, Jacksonville is I've been to Jacksonville. I went to the Super Bowl there. It was fantastic. It's a lovely city. They got some great food there. I love the layout of the bay there and stuff. But there's already they're already hemming and hawing, and the stadium is not anything that's going to last on a longer period of time and stuff. And Orlando's been sitting there waiting, and it wouldn't surprise me, and I think it might be a win-win for everybody. So it would not surprise me if Orlando steps up to the NFL plate and becomes the natural, at least, rival, much more natural rival to Tampa, and by extension, maybe Miami. But I think just that I-5 rivalry idea makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I mean, it does always feel like Jacksonville is kind of the franchise that everybody thinks will be relocated at some point. I mean, for a while they've always thought London, but I think that's a lot more difficult than people want to admit.
Yeah, and again, I'm just looking at the tea leaves, and again, it's all part of the game of stadiums and gamesmanship and brinksmanship and stuff.
Right, yeah.
And look, it's also a bigger market. Let's be honest, it's a bigger television market, and I'm not sure, frankly, how the NFL carves up Orlando, but I think it's like what we talked about with the Raiders, right? The marketing opportunity for the Raiders now. I mean, Las Vegas, by comparison to Oakland and the San Francisco Oakland metropolitan area, it's night and day in terms of market size, right? Las Vegas is not nearly as large. You can fit 4, almost 5 Las Vegases in terms of population into the television market that is the Bay Area, right? I think the same logic applies for Jacksonville and Orlando. And if you can somehow harmonize those markets in some respect, maybe you play a game in Jacksonville, right? Not like the Packers did in Milwaukee for years. You know, they play a game or two in Milwaukee County Stadium. Regionality, I think can be the win-win there, and keep everybody somewhat happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Do you want to give the audience a little bit of a preview of what they can expect from Good Seats Still Available?
Oh, you mean if they haven't fallen asleep already? Of course.
This audience loves it.
I don't know. I appreciate your listeners tolerating my nutso answers, and I do appreciate your listening and your great questions. I'm shocked that you would have listened to all these so intently. I'm honored and overwhelmed. It's Good Seats Still Available, obviously, wherever good podcasts are found, or even frankly where crappy ones are found. We're there too. Just subscribe and rate.
Right next to this one.
Oh, come on. And the website for just the uninitiated, we have all of our episodes there, and just it's very basic, but we'll someday when we have more time on our hands augment it. It's goodseatsstillavailable.com, all one word. All the social links, all that stuff. Follow us on Twitter, Good Seats Still, and blah blah blah. But we appreciate any new listeners. And by the way, the library keeps building, right? So there's no you're not missing anything if you haven't been following us for 4 years. Like Aron has, well, actually, he's only been a year and a half, right? But there's a library there, and chances are there's probably at least the beginnings of a topic you're probably interested in. And if we haven't gotten to yours yet, hang tight, send us an email, and we'll hopefully get to yours sooner rather than later.
You mentioned this before. Do you plan on doing a live episode at some point? I think I heard you say.
Yeah, I certainly want to do all that stuff, right? So I want to do a live episode or two. I'd love to do some, we could do a book club or a movie club of some sort. Like, we could do something around there's so many different sort of adjuncts there. We'd love to do, some documentary type stuff. And there's a whole bunch of things, but it requires time, and it's not, this isn't the day job. So
right.
When it becomes the day job and we have to make a living at it, for now, it's just been more of a passion project, but we appreciate, all the listeners and stuff. And we haven't even hit up people with Patreon or any of that kind of stuff yet. So there's probably a bunch more things we can do to make it even better. But I'd like to think that that's all yet still to come. So if I don't exhaust myself first.
Well, I know there's a lot of people out there that can't wait to see what's coming. So everybody, Tim Hanlon, Good Seats Still Available. I highly recommend it. Tim, thanks for taking the time. I really had a great time talking to you.
Oh, Aron, I appreciate the outreach, and it was likewise. I appreciate your interest, and it was a pleasure chatting with you too. Hopefully, we'll talk again sometime.
Well, all right. That was a boatload of fun. I appreciate Aron having us on his show. And again, of course, that is called The Football Odyssey. And you can find out more about the show at a couple of places. thefootballodyssey.com, as well as the sportshistorynetwork.com, which is, as I said earlier at the top of the show, a collection of really cool sports history-centric podcasts that talk about a lot of different things. Football is a big topic. There's some general sort of sports themes just across sports. There's a basketball one or two. There's even a Canadian football one from the 55-yard line. All great stuff. Again, that's at sportshistorynetwork.com. Just search up the podcast tab there. And again, make sure that you put primarily into your feed going forward, The Football Odyssey with our pal, Aron, and more great stuff. Some great interviews done already with some folks that we've had on our show previously. People like Upton Bell and Michael McCambridge and a whole bunch of others. Highly encouraged, and I think you'll learn a little something along the way, too, in the realm of pigskin. Thank you again to Aron. Thank you, of course, for listening. And we will regale you, hopefully, with a fun new episode next week here on this very little feed. We appreciate your listening. You know where you can find us on social media and the website and all that stuff. Enjoy the summer, and we'll see you next week, God willing. Thanks for listening, and take care. Bye-bye.